The last element we're going to add to this action scene through the import node is a 3D model. In Smoke, we cannot create 3D models, but if we have one from a compatible program, we can import it into our scene and even manipulate some of the values that were set by that 3D application. I'm going to continue working in the same scene we had before. As long as you're in an action scene, you'll be able to do this import. You don't need to have all of the work done from the last 2 lessons. To get back to my action node bin, I'm going to click here on this button that says Action Bin. And I'm going to once again double click on this import node. The model that I have for you to import is a 3D Studio model. So in the file type down here, I'm going to drop down to the option for 3D Studio. Be sure you've navigated into the Action Elements folder inside of our Imports folder of our footage. And inside of this folder that says Piranha, I'm going to go in here and there's my Piranha 3ds file. Now with the Photoshop file, once I had the Photoshop file type selected and clicked on the file, it immediately began the import. Different file types work different ways. For 3D Studio, I select the file type and then I do need to come over here to the left to click Load. The way you can always tell is if there is a load button, you will need to click that to bring the file into the scene. If there isn't a load button, clicking on the file will do it automatically. But I'm going to click the load button. And here I now have a 3D model of a piranha inside of my animated little medieval town. And this works in some of the same ways that I talked to you about with the Photoshop file. There is a top axis here to manipulate the entire model. And right now my schematic's getting a little messy. I'm going to hold down my Option key and drag that top axis node over here to get it out of the way. I'm just trying to make it a little cleaner around here so it's easier for you to see what I'm working on. If I want to manipulate this fish, I will double click on the top axis node to get control to the entire object. And by the way, I'm going to come over here and turn Auto Key back off from when I had it turned on to animate the camera. Right now I just want to take a look at this model and not animate anything. So with that axis node at the top double clicked, any changes I make here in the axis controls affect the entire model. So for instance, I could rotate this fish around on its y-axis for you to see that this is a 3D model with depth. We have inherited all of those features from 3D Studio. I can also grab the controls here to, for instance, pull this fish around in space and make sure it's sitting inside of the layers where I want it to sit. You can move things forward and back in Z space. You can manipulate that how you want. The other interesting thing is that most of our 3D modeling tools will also give us access to controls that let us change how this object looks in terms of its outside texture. If I double click on this node that says Material, it takes me to controls specific to that material. This will allow me to do things like maybe try to change how the fish looks by adjusting some of the colors of some of the different elements of the material. We can change the ambient light of the material. I'm raising those values and I'm adjusting the color of that fish just slightly. I can change how diffuse or how light those levels are to change how that light reflects. So you will be able to control some of the values that came from that 3D Studio. Our main axis control at the top allows us to adjust the entire element. So again, I could use the Auto key and animate this fish to swim through our little town. You have some different options there. But again, you have the ability to inherit objects from a flame artist or a 3D Studio artist to bring into your smoke scene as part of your finished product. It's good to know how to get those objects into the scene and that you do still have some options for manipulating that object once it's in your scene. And the last thing I want to show you is something we saw in the last action scene we created when we started with that 1 frame gap. I'm going to exit back out to the timeline. We still have this 1 frame gap rather than our entire scene. But again, if I zoom in a little bit, either using my Command plus or by clicking and dragging up on my scroll bar, I still have 119 frames left of that scene. I'll hit R to turn my cursor into the trim tool. I'll click on the edge of that clip. I'll type plus 119. And I now have access to the entire scene. Again, I would need to render this before it would play back in the timeline, but I can always drop my playhead on any single frame and see what's happening at that point in the timeline. If I hit Shift Z to fit this to the timeline, I can now see I have this full 5-second scene. during which my camera moves, the smoke layers move back and forth. I've created that scene, and I've now made it available in my timeline.